my partner, and George for being here. So we're going to start by saying that the United States should impose severe sanctions on developing countries that nationalize the oil industries, and we're going to give you some reasons why. So the first reason is basically, the economic principle, the principle of market acts, and business principle. And we feel like that markets that aren't free, prices usually tend to rise, and we could see this generally in the nationalization by the Labour Party in Britain, and the huge reaction that it's gotten with Thatcher coming in with the Conservatives and then making the government more efficient. We see this, post-World War, Labour coming into power, they nationalized a lot of the industries, and then even with China, when Mao came in, nationalized a lot of these industries, and these industries became under one national control, and they were really, really inefficient. They were like losing profits. They can't gain anything, and I'm sure you very all know about the communes in China when they were producing, and that caused a terrible, disastrous famine in China. And then afterwards, with coming into the Deng Xiaoping, you see basically farms becoming much more efficient. They grew surpluses, and people became prosperous. And there is much more economic gain. Sit down, please. Much more economic gain during that time. And it's the same thing that we see in Britain. You see nationalized like British Airways, railroads, a lot of these things, and they became really inefficient. And then when you have Margaret Thatcher coming up, then you see it become really inefficient. So that's the first part. The second part of this, first argument's, principle is that it's really not fair for the corporations who already spend so much money, investing in these countries, putting up the infrastructure to get the oil out from underground to there, and then the government just comes and barges in and just nationalizes it, saying, well, it's part of national, you don't have any control. And then, this is really bad for business. This is, really an unfair principle, but you seem to disagree. Yeah, isn't the United States government going to look awfully bad if they're trying to defend companies and by putting sanctions on poor people in countries? Isn't that going to result in a great deal of backlash? 1 second, we'll get to that later, and we will see. But so that's the first point, and I'll show you in the third point why that won't be the case. So the second point that I'll talk about is why it's actually in the U.S.'s interest to basically impose these sanctions, because as I've said, as I've shown you, what happens when we nationalize industries, prices will rise, and there will be, it's not good for the United States economy when we have high oil prices, and we've seen it in the past few weeks. What happens, and the national, and then UPenn, we could see that in the 70s when they became one combined together, unified force. They tended to gouge prices up, and then they purposely, make prices really, really high and do all these things, and these are really detrimental to the international economy. These are really, detrimental, and not in the U.S.'s interest. But also, Mr. Speaker, if we have private oil companies, I'm sorry, Madam Speaker, terribly sorry about that. But also, Madam Speaker, if we have private companies rather than a public company, ideology doesn't come into play. Some of these countries may not have the most positive attitude towards the United States, and we think that business and though business and politics are they do combine together, I'm not going to disagree, but that they should be minimized, because you don't want a country that's like, oh, we don't like the U.S., blah, 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 all these things, and we don't like them, and therefore we're going to gouge prices on them. This is really bad. And private companies, with private companies, they don't have any of that interest. Instead, they're like, we're here to make a profit, and we're here to make a gain, and it doesn't matter about the ideology. Like in China, as Deng Xiaoping said, black cat, white cat, who cares? As long as it captures mice, it's a good cat. But with government and put ideology in these things, it really bogs down. It really bogs down the competition, and it will really keep prices high. And I think I explained this already, but it's also competitive with private companies because they compete with each other to keep prices low, rather than you have one monolithic thing that decides and jacks up the price. And we believe that this is really important. So the second point that I would really like to talk about is it's bad for the country that basically does this, because we see a tendency when there's we see a tendency with OPEC, what happened in the 70s when, sudden soar prices and, high prices. And then we see what happened when all of a sudden they, advanced industrialized countries try to find other alternatives, after the damage has already been done, and then prices suddenly drop. And then all of a sudden the countries don't, have any way of profit. And, because we see that in these countries, the only outlet for profit is in the oil industry. And because it's in They're only outlet in the oil industry, and because they only gain their profits from the oil industry, they have no other means to gain profits. And then once the oil prices drop, you're not going to, where you're going to have unemployment, you're going to have unemployment, and depression leads to social unrest, and this is really bad for society itself. But also, what was it? Or also, like, sorry, I just lost my train of thought. But also, sorry. But also, Madam Speaker, when we're trying to get these developing nations to have an advance, like get their economy developed, you need an initial capital investment. And I think this is really important because we showed in the first point that I've said it's really unfair for business. I didn't explicitly state this, but implicitly apply when you nationalize something that makes it really bad and seeking environment for investments. It's really not positive for the country because investors don't want to go there. They don't have that stability saying, well, it's like if I go in there and any day, my investments could be just taken away. I mean, you wouldn't put it into a bank, or it says, well, the next day it just goes bankrupt, and then you don't get any of your money during the Great Depression. And we feel like it's also really bad because with this, you don't get any investments into the country and to start your own industry because you get profits from oil. That's true, but with any major industry, you need an initial capital investment, like we see that was what happened in China. And from that investment, then you can develop these industries. And this is, as I've said, we see this in China when they open up the doors and then they let economic investments in. And this is how development in China and economic gains in China begins. But you disagree.
Say there's an initial capital investment and whatnot, and the jobs are there and the company functions. But is that really going to make sure that the profits gained by that corporation actually stay in that country to help those people?
As I've said, in China, look, Madam Speaker, look at the example I give you in China. They open the door, investments come in, you have factories, you have jobs, and yes, there is a lot of problems in China. I'm not going to disagree, but that's not really the point. If you actually look at the statistics, the real income gain, you have like, I don't know, double or triple, and China in the past 20 or lifted about, an unprecedented number of people. I think it was like 300 to 400 million people out of this world poverty line, and I think that's a really, really great accomplishment what you did. And I think all of this shows that if you want, to have a country not dependent, it's good for the country. You need to have a positive business environment, and I think the last point really shows that. And I think the last point really, clearly shows why we should do this. Then, for all these reasons, we proudly propose.
I thank the Prime Minister for his eloquent remarks and invite Leader of Opposition to give his introduction speech, not to exceed 8 minutes. Hear, hear.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm pleased to be speaking in front of you and gracious onlookers. Thanks, Gov, for constructing a great case, and thanks to Sam. She's been awesome so far, and I hope that this round is just as good. So that being said, we have 3 off-case points about why we think that you shouldn't, why you should reject this, why you should not impose severe sanctions on developing countries that nationalize their industries. The first independent point is about doing anything unilaterally in this situation is really just not a great idea. Recognize that nationalization is something, establishing a foreign policy that is unilateral in its application of an idea should be crafted when there is an actually good idea that actually exists. I don't think that Gov has provided a really clear philosophy for saying, why is this always going to be in every single time our best interest, every single developing country? They've only cited the example of China, and while maybe it's worked there, maybe not, it's still not going to be enough to actually give them the win. It's not going to be enough to say that they're entirely endorsing this resolution. So there's no really sound philosophical basis behind this to say why we should be doing it all the time. And I think not taking it on a case-by-case basis is really imprudent. Because recognize that when you take a very staunch disregard a lot of the side consequences, I think you end up with a lot of bad policy. I mean, look at the United States war on terror.